Good evening. Welcome everybody. It is so wonderful to see so many people here, and I just am very thankful that you could join us. My name is Marnette Ortman-Hofer. I am the executive director and the archivist over at Heritage Hall Museum and Archives, and we are thrilled to be able to put on this program this evening. This presentation was made possible in part by some generous donations from local folks and from a grant that we received through the South Dakota Humanities Council. And this also helped us bring the Voices of Conscience exhibit that I hope many of you have had the chance to go through, that is over at the Bethel Mennonite Church on the museum complex. And I should have said that they're an affiliate of the National Endowment of the Humanities. I made myself a note and it's highlighted and I still forgot. Formalities. You are in for a treat this evening. Dr. Duane Stoltzfus and Dora Maendel have joined up to tell this story. Dora is a teacher and a storyteller from the Fairholme Hutterite Colony up in Manitoba. And Dr. Duane Stoltzfus is professor of communications at Goshen College in Indiana. He's written a book, I should have brought it up here, that is called Pacifists in Chains, The Persecution of Hutterites During the Great War. We have some books for sale in the back, and we carry that book in our mercantile at the museum. And it's a good read. He spent several years as a New York Times editor, and he definitely knows how to research a topic. They are joining up to give the presentation this evening. I think I will let them give the rest of an introduction. Dora and Duane.
So the story begins in Russia and begins with a recognition that there's nothing about soldiering in the Hutterite DNA. And the communal church to which they belonged had been resolutely set against warfare for 400 years. And the Russians were wanting to expand their army, to expand conscription and make sure that all young men were participating. And with that threat hanging over them, a group of Hutterites and Mennonites sent a delegation to the United States and Canada to scout out some farmland. They were ready to move halfway across the world in order to ensure that they were not forced to participate in the military. And at the time, the United States was eager for settlers. And so as they were traveling, and so as they traveled around and they were looking at land, an opportunity came up to meet with the most powerful American, the President of the United States, Ulysses Grant, invited several Hutterites to his summer cottage on Long Island because he wanted to make a personal appeal for them to bring all of their farming experience and skill from Russia to the United States. And think about that. It's incredible that here you would have these, fairly, humble German-speaking farmers from Russia who would join the president at his fancy seaside home on Long Island. And the Hutterites explained that they were hardworking, they were law-abiding, they were interested in moving, but there was one very important thing. They wanted the president to promise that they would be free of military engagement here in the United States. And the president, he made the prospect of a draft sound very, very unlikely. He said he couldn't absolutely promise that there wouldn't be a war and that they wouldn't be asked to do something, but he said that there should be at least 50 years of peace with no worries about any military engagement. So, in the decades that followed, the Hutterites did well. They moved, they set up colonies, they flourished in this land here in South Dakota. And this would have been in the 1870s. The farms were among the largest and the richest in the state. The Rockport Colony, for example, where the Hofer brothers and Jacob Whipf came from, had 23 families sharing in that ownership and management, 25. They were working 4,000 acres, 500 head of cattle, 130 horses, 1,500 sheep. They were doing well. And then the shadow of war that darkened in Europe first, spread across the ocean, came to the United States, and well short of that anticipated 50 years that the President Ulysses Grant had spoken of, the United States found itself entering into World War I. So on April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson, for a complex set of reasons, but among them that Germany had been in some ways taking the war directly to the United States. So the U.S. entered into the war, and on June 5th, 1917, the government required all physically able men between the ages of 21 and 30 to prepare for duty. The Hutterites had 3 strikes against them. First of all, they were a German-speaking people, so they spoke the language of the enemy nation. And beyond that, they practiced community of goods, and practicing a kind of, sharing of almost, some people would have thought of it as a communistic sort of sharing of goods in a country that prized capitalism and prized individual opportunity and responsibility. So that was the second strike. And the third strike was that they were non-resistant pacifists. Their neighbors here in South Dakota called them slackers and Russian Cloonies. So in the spring of 1918, in this community, the U.S. Army summoned 4 young Hutterites from Rockport to war.
When I tell this story to children or young people back home in Canada, I always begin with a question, and I ask them, did you know that there was a time when there was no Hutterite colony in Canada? Not a single Hutterite living anywhere on the prairie provinces or in Manitoba. So this is the story of how the Hutterites came to Canada. As it turned out, as Duane pointed out, President Ulysses S. Grant was right, and the Hutterites were able to flourish here in Dakota Territory, building various colonies, learning or refining their farming skills, and especially their livestock raising skills. And then in 1914, when the war broke out, overnight they became enemy aliens, regarded with suspicion by their neighbors because they spoke German. And their speaking German lent credence to the rumors that they secretly supported Germany in this conflict. In one instance, colony livestock was stolen and sold, with the money going to various organizations involved in the war effort. And the Red Cross, to their credit, when they found out that the money allotted to them came from this source, they gave it back. When Congress passed the Act of Conscription in 1918, 4 young men from the Rockport colony, Joseph, Michael, and David Hofer, brothers, and David's brother-in-law, Jacob Whipf, received letters of conscription. The churches before that, what we call the peace churches, the Mennonites, the Amish, and the Hutterites, had made attempts to negotiate with the government a conscientious objectors program should a war break out, but it never materialized. So that when people received their letters, different people received different kinds of advice. And when the prediger, the minister of Rockport, inquired, he was advised that the best thing to do would be for the 4 brothers to do exactly what the letters of conscription asked them to do, namely to board the troop train and appeal at the designated military camp to the commander there and explain their situation to him. At the Brotherhood meeting, this was discussed, and the Brotherhood agreed. This is what the 4 brothers would do. Explain the stand against violence to the commander once they arrive at the military camp. The older people at Rockport remembered their history, and they also recalled an incident where in the 16th century Jacob Hutter had been banished from his community with his whole community by Ferdinand of Moravia, the Archduke Ferdinand, because there was all this suspicion about people living in a group, pooling their resources, and a lot of suspicion, especially against the leaders. So at this Brotherhood meeting, the minister read an excerpt from a letter that Jacob Hutter wrote out on the heath to Archduke Ferdinand, explaining the Hutterite stand on military activity. And Duane will read us this excerpt.
Here we lie on the barren earth, as God wills, without harm to anyone. We do not wish to do harm or evil to any man, yea, not even our worst enemy. And all of our life and deeds, words, and works are open to all. Yes, before we would strike our greatest enemy with the hand, to say nothing of with the gun or sword, as the world does, we would rather die and let our own lives be taken. We have no material weapons, neither spear nor gun, as anyone can see.
When Joseph returned from the Brotherhood meeting and went home to tell his wife what the decision was, Maria wept openly. And he was in the position of being afraid and anxious of what awaits him, as well as having to comfort his wife. It is frightening, he agreed, but we have to trust God. We also have to remember the teaching that we heard in church on Sunday about how God always finds a way to care for those who walk in his ways. Yes, Maria responded, I wish my faith were stronger. And Joseph continued and said, remember all of the miraculous ways in which God helped the Kind of Israel, the children of Israel in the desert, and David fleeing for his life from King Saul. But I'll be here alone with our 2 children, she said, not knowing when you'll be back. Another example, he said, is how Jesus cautioned his disciples when they were in the boat on the stormy sea and admonished them for having so little faith. Yes, she said, but I had a terrible dream last night. In my dream, I saw gophers gnawing at your toes, yours and those of the 3 other brothers. And then Joseph said to her, we can't rely on dreams. Dreams are not reliable. And I can't tell you how it comforts me to know that you won't be alone. Not only my family, but the whole community will be here supporting you and taking care of you. And I'm convinced God will bless this for something good. The next morning, the community gathered for a tearful farewell. The 4 men were driven to Mitchell, South Dakota, to board the train. And already on the train, their troubles began. It was noisy and crowded with young men who had enlisted. They opened the door to their cabin and challenged them. Don't you know that beards are not allowed in the military? Why are you wearing beards? And David tried to explain that that Hutterite men wear beards as a biblical sign of simplicity. And Jacob added and said, also in our community, it is the married men who wear beards, and it's also a sign of belonging to the Brotherhood Council. One of them belligerently said, well, we'll counsel you when not to wear beards. And then they took them and physically held them down, cut off their hair as well as their beards. And the account that originally returned to the community of this event indicates that it was the profanity that bothered the brothers most of all. And so, tearful and demoralized, they arrive at Fort Lewis, Washington, at the military camp. At this juncture, we're going to hear a traditional Hutterite hymn in German. Colloquially, it's called Ist Gemeinschaftlied, because this was the spring of the year. And for these men, so sad and frightened, there would have been memories of the most recent Pentecost celebration, where this song is always sung. And what it really is an expression of deep devotion for the gift of Christian community, but also a lament that human beings are still so reluctant to embrace the message of Christian brotherhood.
Sing
At the military camp the next day, David asked to speak to the lieutenant commander, and he was given an audience. He explained who they were, that they were born into this Hutterite community, were raised in it, chose to become baptized and members of the community. But the commander said that he cannot grant military exemption to anyone, and said to them, "This is the wrong place for you to have come. Here you have to follow orders, and if you never learn to obey orders, this is where you will learn." So because they refused to even don the uniforms, they were immediately imprisoned. And 3 weeks later, they appeared before a court-martial where they were rigorously interrogated about their faith, why they chose to become baptized, why they chose to get married, who chose their marriage partner for them, but especially they were challenged, what would you do if somebody attacked your sister? What would you do if someone attacked your mother? Challenging questions such as those, which they tried their best to answer in their halting English. And in the end, they simply said, "We don't know what we would do. All we know is that in our community, brotherhood is emphasized, and we are taught from a very early age that violence is not a way to solve problems or conflicts." At the end, they were declared guilty and given a verdict of 37 years in the prison at Alcatraz in the Bay of California. Out of kindness and mercy, it was reduced to 20 years. And so, escorted by 4 armed officers, shackled to each other by their hands and feet, they traveled by train to Alcatraz.
I want to say just a few words yet about their experience at Camp Lewis, by way of setting that context. So as Dora said, when they arrived at Camp Lewis, they arrived at in effect at a city. It was the largest of the training camps during World War I. And you get a sense here from this overview of how expansive that city or military camp was. There were 15 National Army camps in the country at the time, and basically, if you stood in the Texas Panhandle and you looked straight north and drew a line straight north, and then looked west from that line, all of those young people were headed to Camp Lewis at American Lake in Washington. Recruits came from Alaska, they came from California, from Idaho, from Montana, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and South Dakota. This camp stretched across about 70,000 acres. As they arrived, they would have arrived at this front entrance. And the camp was bursting at the seams. There was an urgency to get as many young people overseas to the front lines as possible. The Allies were having a difficult time standing off against the Germans. So to accommodate the overflow, people were sleeping in hay sheds, and some were sleeping outdoors in tents. Meals were being served at 6 in the morning, at 12 noon in the evening, and listen to what they were eating. For breakfast, the cooks would pile on metal plates and steak and potatoes and rice. That was breakfast. And the lunch would have a similar kind of meal with pie, and in the evening there was another large meal. So they were consuming sometimes nearly 5,000 calories per person each day. Now, they were eating this much because they were expected to work hard. They were training infantrymen to go to the front lines in France. And you could catch some of the excitement of this mission, this work, in the memoirs of a young Mennonite from California. His name is David Jansen, and his letters and memoir remind us that within this large Anabaptist family, including Hutterites, Mennonites, Brethren, within this large Anabaptist family, people were making different decisions about how to respond to this call to serve the country, to serve the common good. And David Jansen arrived as well at Fort Lewis, and here's what he said. He said, after 30 days of drilling, it was easily seen how a fat pouch began to slide off of a roly-poly man, or how a spindly bank teller set his feet down firm and solid, and a swing came to the men as they marched to and from the drill ground. He was enjoying, might not be the right word, but he was caught up in the moment, in the mission, in the importance of what they were doing. Now, he was not going to be he was not going to pick up, a gun and serve on the front lines, but he was participating as a soldier, as a non-combatant soldier. And he spoke in his letters about not understanding why the Hutterites weren't willing to do what he was willing to do. He regarded himself as a faithful follower of Jesus, as a conscientious objector. And he said the least he can do in this setting, being called upon by the country, would be to put on a uniform and help in nonviolent ways. For the Hofer brothers and Jacob Whip, they drew the line at a different place. When they arrived at this camp, they said, we can't put on a uniform. We can't fill out this form that asks for our name and how old we are and where we live, because at the top of the form it says statement of soldier. We're not soldiers. So they drew the line differently. They were court-martialed, fairly short trial. It was foreordained that they were going to be found guilty, and they were, and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. As that was going on, and people were training, they were also being given time to relax, to go to the library. There were sports activities at this camp/city of Camp Lewis. Now, one last thing I want to say about this setting and at this time period. The United States came reluctantly to the war. Many people said, this is not our battle to fight. This is for the Europeans to fight. We shouldn't spill blood over their conflict. But once the decision was made to go to war, then the country, as if overnight, put on the armor of a different nation. And there was a super patriotism that just spread across the country. Towns were renamed. German towns suddenly took on English names, and food changed names, right? And the one very visible example of this kind of hyper-patriotism could be found in Tacoma, the town right near Camp Lewis, where they set about to make the largest United States flag ever made. They tried to hang it, but every time they put this flag on a pole, it snapped the pole. Eventually, they just hung it off the top of this building. but it is an indication of the kind of very visible commitment to the United States and its cause at this time. And maybe I'll just pick up a little bit as we into the next section, headed to Alcatraz. As Dora said, they were taken down to Alcatraz, chained, and accompanied by a couple of lieutenants as they made their way down to Alcatraz. And the island of Alcatraz was a fearsome place. It was cut off, it was cold, it was windswept, and as they approached the island, they would have had this view. There was a sense of foreboding, of being cut off evermore from family, from their community. They were taken on a launch like this to a dock, and they were escorted off onto land. They made their way up a series of switchbacks to the top of the island, to the cell house, and once inside, they would have had a chance to see the kind of industrial prison complex that Alcatraz was. They were given a chance when they were here to put on a uniform, to do some kind of work, break rock, something. But they refused to cooperate in any way because they said, we are not soldiers. We cannot put on anything belonging to the military. And so they were escorted down the steps, 14 steps to the bottom, led down the hall, and led to a series of cells in 4 different corners of the basement. And this is clearly a more recent photo. It's one that my wife and I took when we visited about 15 years ago. But there would have been bars on front of those, and the men were in as I say, set aside in 4 different corners in solitary confinement in this basement. You know, they wrote letters home about their experience, and those letters helped to make possible the telling of the story in their voices. Without the letters, we wouldn't. There would be a lot of, the agony and the emotional distress and the fear and the sense that the world was ending. All of that came through in the letters. But they also chose not to include a lot of details about what their lives were like, and the specifics of their suffering. They didn't write about that, and they would always express their trust in God and sense that no matter what, they would be taken care of, even if it meant that they would leave this world soon to go to the next world. So sometimes we rely on other people to fill in with some of the details. And I would like to, if I can find this, there is a note from, here we go. There was someone else who also had been sentenced to, as a conscientious objector, to the dungeon, or the hole, as it was known at Alcatraz, down in the basement. His name was Philip Grosser, and he, in a sense, can speak for the Hutterites as he did in sparing no detail in describing that setting. He said, "The hardest things to endure in the dungeon were the complete darkness, the sitting and the sleeping on the damp concrete floor, and the lack of sight or sound of any human being. The 18 ounces of bread was quite sufficient after the first few days," he said. And toward the end, he said, "I had bread left over, enough to share with the rats, which were quite peaceful and friendly.
When they arrived in Alcatraz, they were again ordered to put on the uniform, and when they refused, they were told by the guard, if that's the way you're going to conduct yourselves here, then we may have to carry you out dead, the way we carried out 4 yesterday. At this dungeon, they spent the next 4 months, and these were the hottest months of the year. Their diet was toyed with. Sometimes they received bread and water. Other times, for a number of days, it was fine, regular meals, and then again, just bread and water. They were also again regularly interrogated very rigorously and sometimes beaten with iron rods. The place where they had to sleep was the wet cement floor in just their light underclothes because they refused to don the uniform. No mattress, no sheet, not even a wooden board, just that damp cement floor, because the walls of Alcatraz are, of course, it's an island, and so the ocean there is frequently stormy and beats against that wall. So the cells were very damp, which made the heat even more oppressive. And because they were chained to the cell doors by day, 9 hours every day, that was the punishment for refusing to work, they couldn't even chase off the mosquitoes. And only on Sunday were they allowed outside to walk around the compound for some fresh air and exercise, along with the other prisoners. Their arms were covered with a ghastly rash, and they were very swollen from being chained for so long. And it is said that some of the other prisoners actually had tears in their eyes when they saw them, and one of them was heard to ask, "Is this a way to treat human beings?" In these terrible times, they still found a miraculous way to comfort each other. Even though they were in solitary confinement, far enough away where they couldn't speak to each other, once in a while they heard a snippet of a prayer. And one day one brother was heard to pray, "O Almighty God of heaven and earth." But they found a wonderful way to communicate, the same one that our forefathers found when they were imprisoned in the dungeons of Europe. Softly down the tier, one brother would begin a song, maybe a morning hymn or an evening hymn, and the others, when they heard, would say, "Oh, thank God he's still alive," and would softly sing along. And one day, when they were being beaten with iron rods once more, Michael actually fell down unconscious. And so the next song that we're going to be hearing is an Easter song, O Haupt voll Blut und Wunden.
Mit
So the war finally came to an end, and San Francisco celebrated the armistice with a human chain of 5,000 people who gathered at the Civic Center. They were wearing their masks. They had just been facing this terrible flu pandemic. Many lives were lost, and so they were still wearing masks as a precaution. Like so much of the rest of the city or the country, just emerging from that pandemic. When the war, at least on paper, came to an end, November 11th, 1918. 3 days after the armistice, the Hutterites left Alcatraz, headed now to Fort Leavenworth. Under an overcast sky, with the chilly rain, they boarded a train for the Army's main disciplinary barracks, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. They were guarded by 6 sergeants on the way. And Fort Leavenworth presented itself as a school of second chances. At Fort Leavenworth, the commanders believed that they would be able to give people an opportunity. People who had done wrong in one way or another, had failed to follow the law or serve the country as they should have, but they could arrive at Fort Leavenworth and there straighten out their lives and contribute in some way. And there was a lot of work to be done. In many ways, Leavenworth was this a series of efficient factories. It was a small city that had all kinds of work underway. It was a self-supporting hub of productivity that, yes, the prisoners were there, being forced to be there, but during the day they would fan out across the property. Some of them would work in shoe shops like this one. They were involved in all sorts of operations. As an example, the agriculture unit, which was, by the way, called a colony, a farm colony, included dairy and poultry and hog operations. There was a canner, there was a garden, greenhouses, and in 1 year alone, Fort Leavenworth manufactured almost 2,000 brooms, and the corn for the brooms was grown on 16 acres of land. There was a tailor shop where they made, in 1 year, 22,000 civilian and military garments. And here's the cafeteria, a kind of visual reminder of the order and the precision that was applied to this city of Fort Leavenworth. There's some other folks working the fields. Secretary Baker, Secretary of War, made clear his intention, his commitment to see that everyone was contributing. And it was important, he said, to develop men and keep them from going to waste, to make useful citizens of them, he said. And so it was in this place that the 3 Hofer brothers and Jacob Whipf arrived.
So that November night, when they arrived at Fort Leavenworth, they were told that they would need to march up to the prison on foot. We're not giving you a ride. It was a November night, cold and windy, and they were forced to stand by the door to wait for their prison uniforms. And finally they came about 1 o'clock in the morning. And by that time, their arms were so stiff and cold they could hardly put them on. And at this point it became clear that Joseph and Michael were very ill. So they were taken immediately to the infirmary, while David and Jacob Whipf were taken to solitary confinement. A few days later, a guard came to David's cell and told him that his brother is really ill. would he like to send a telegram back to the community and let them know? David was so shocked that he fainted. So it was actually Jake Whipf who sent the telegram. And immediately 2 ministers and the wives of the 2 men boarded a train for Fort Leavenworth and arrived 2 days later because they had lost a whole day going in the wrong direction on the advice of a station agent. So here they come to Fort Leavenworth. They see this imposing prison and they have no idea how to enter a prison like that, excuse me, and speak to the commander there. So they decide to go to a restaurant first and get something to eat. And while they're eating, somebody walks up to their table and says to them, I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, and I understand that you are quite apprehensive about how to enter Fort Leavenworth prison. And they agreed and said, yes, you're right. And he said, you're right. The commander there is a very stern man. And when you go in there and state your request, as you must, he'll say no. But don't let that faze you. Repeat your request and he will say no again. But he won't say no a third time. So this gentleman left the restaurant and they thanked him, but then they thought they should thank him more profusely and ran after him to do that, but they could find no trace of him. And then they decided it must have been an angel because they said, in the first place, how come he knew what we were talking about? We were speaking Hutterisch, our dialect. But in any case, it gave them the courage they needed to go in. And the commander said to them, the third time, it's too late. Joseph has already died. And that's when Joseph's widow, Maria, marched past the commander's desk to the other room and saw his coffin. She opened the coffin to look at him, and there he was, dressed in the American military uniform. And she actually had the courage to demand, you would force my husband to wear in death the uniform that he refused to wear in life. And the ministers also said to the commander, this must never happen again. That evening, or an evening later, a guard came to David's cell again and said to him, your brother Michael is dying and you are permitted to sit at his bedside with his family. So David went. And that night, Michael, in the middle of the night, with David watching, suddenly raised his arms and said in German, Vater, in deine Hände befehle ich meinen Geist. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. David returned to his cell, and the next day he again was chained to his cell door. And he later reported, all day I stood there weeping, and I couldn't even wipe away my own tears. It seemed like there wasn't a soul in that place with us, and nobody really cared. But that evening, a guard came by, and David said to him, could you at least place me in the cell right beside Jacob Whipf, so at least the two of us will be together? So the guard left and came back later and said, you need to gather up your things and come with me. The commander wants to see you. So when he walked up to the commander's desk, there was a paper on it, and the commander said, if you sign this, you'll be released. So David did. Released it and was escorted to the gates of the prison. But just outside the gates, he suddenly remembered Jacob Whipf. And then he said, he was standing there and wondering whether this is really true or is it a dream. And then a guard walked up to him and he said, how come you're loitering here? So David told the guard, they tell me I'm free, but I really can't quite believe it. And the guard said to him, I've worked here for a long time, and I've never ever seen anybody exit those gates unless it was with permission. So since you're here, I would suggest that you are allowed to go. And then David requested from him and said, but my brother-in-law is still in there, and I hadn't a chance to say goodbye. Could you let me in so I can do that? And the guard, of course, said, that's not something I'm allowed to do, but if you write him a note, I'll deliver it. And we have evidence that he kept his word because Jacob Whipf wrote to his wife, and Duane will read us that excerpt. I'll do that after, but you read this first.
Sometimes I can't help envying my 3 brothers who are already released from this torture. I wonder, why is the hand of the Lord so heavy upon me? I, who tried to remain faithful to God and to my community, why must I continue my solitary suffering? But then an incredible peace comes over me, such that I could weep with joy when I remember that our Lord considers me worthy to suffer for his name's sake. And I must confess, compared with our confinement in Alcatraz, this life here, the Fort Leavenworth military prison, is like living in a palace.
So this was really the loneliest time of all for Jacob Whipf, knowing he is there alone. And during those months of despair, he read Psalm 42. As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my meat day and night, while they continuously say unto me, where is thy God? When I remember these things, I pour out my soul in me. For I had gone with the multitude. I went with them to the house of God, with the voice of joy and praise, with a multitude that kept holy day. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? And why art thou disquieted within me? Hope thou in God, for I shall yet praise him, who is the health of my countenance and my God. And the song we're going to hear is based on this message. Jacob Whipf was not released until April 12th, 1919, long after the armistice was signed. Hutterites had received word from the Canadian government that they were welcome to settle on the prairies, and negotiations were promptly completed to immigrate to Canada. And I think I'd like to add something here, because all of us can do with a message of how often something good comes out of something bad. Years before, an attempt had been made to establish a colony in Canada, and it was at Dominion City in the southern part of Manitoba. But things did not go well, and they eventually moved back again to South Dakota. But in the process, they had completed all the paperwork necessary to immigrate, which is why it was possible at this juncture for them to just up and move, because all of that was already in place. And the Canadian Prime Minister knew who they were, and so it was an unusually quick process. And I think sometimes people have that question here, how was that possible? The people of Rockport established their new colony in Canada, in Alberta. The people of the Wolf Creek colony in Saskatchewan, and the people of Bonhomme in Manitoba, which is the group of people from where I come. And so, that's how Hutterites came to the prairie provinces of Canada in 1918. This includes the descendants of Joseph Hofer, whose prophetic words of faith to his wife continue to be richly fulfilled. And I think Duane visited some of those communities, right, in his research. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience.
I want to share a few thoughts in concluding by way of a kind of postscript. And one is to ask the question, so what happened to Joseph and Michael? Why did they die? The U.S. government said the official cause of death was pneumonia, that they were not alone in falling ill and in dying in those conditions at Leavenworth or elsewhere in confinement. To the Hutterites, though, the men died of mistreatment, and in that weakened state, in having endured all that time, standing in chains, diet of bread and water, it was no wonder that they passed away. And when they died, how was that word shared? How was it sent back here in South Dakota? Certainly, by word of mouth, amid sorrow, the word was shared in the colonies. But outside of that, it's interesting to note that the Freeman Courier, which would have been the primary delivery platform for news, the Freeman Courier throughout the war had been promoting participation, promoting and celebrating the soldiers who had gone to fight and those who died on the front lines. But when the word came that Joseph and Michael Hofer had died, there was not even an obituary. Instead, there was a column of local news notes in the Freeman Courier. And on page 8, in a single sentence, and I would note that this sentence came in a column right next to an announcement that a church had decided to buy a paper cutter, and right next to another announcement that Sam K. Hofer is building a kitchen and an auto shed. Right next to those two announcements, there was only this: the two sons of Jacob Hofer of Rockport died in a Washington camp. They had that wrong. We know where they died. Died and were buried at home. That was it. That was it. The only news that was formally shared. A couple of other things. The Secretary Baker was sure that they would be able, that all of the commanders, U.S. military was going to be able to get people to line up. That World War I was seen as an opportunity to create a single unified body of Americans and bringing people together from different ethnic groups, different nationalities, different languages. There had been a great inflow of immigrants to the United States in the years before the war. And so here was an opportunity to get people to work together as one. And yes, we had these conscientious objectors, and he knew about them, but he was sure that they could be reasoned with, that they would come around when they realized what was being asked of them was important and it was necessary and reasonable. And it didn't work that way. There was no taking people whose DNA was such that they were devoted followers of Jesus. They would not raise a hand against even their worst enemies, and get them to pivot and behave differently. And so Baker and others thought, oh well, it must be because they're not as smart as other people. And they ask, there were words used like, they described the Hutterites and Mennonites and Amish as being bovine-like, cow-like. That they, yes, they could read the Bible, but beyond that, they really had no sense of the world or ability to reason. And the military asked Mark May, a psychologist from the University of Syracuse, to conduct intelligence tests to confirm that indeed that was the main issue with these conscientious objectors. And May came back with the results, and as it turned out, the conscientious objectors scored much higher on the intelligence tests than the average soldiers. And May said that based on the upbringing, on the surroundings in which these COs had been raised, on their family and their church and everything that had shaped them, he said it would have been unthinkable to ask them to become, someone who was ready to take up arms and kill an enemy. And we know that after World War I, there was a kind of recognition that a small number of conscientious objectors had caused so much trouble. And they were ready to die. They were on starvation diets, and there was no advantage to the military in dealing with that again. And so things changed by World War II. And I won't say much here now, but just know that there are amazing accounts of conscientious objectors in World War II participating in scientific and medical experiments. And this was made possible because the government chose to cooperate in a partnership with the historic peace churches in creating civilian public service camps for people to do work of national importance. And some of that work involved medical and science experiments, including at the University of Minnesota, a starvation diet, the first systematic study of what happens to the mind, body, and spirit when you are deprived of food, when you, in effect, are wasted away. And it was COs who volunteered to participate in that experiment. I've done a little research on that. I hope someday to write a book on that. I would say if you're a fan of Malcolm Gladwell, and you listen to his podcast, Revisionist History, know that coming up, I think in June, when the new series comes out, there will be a two-part program related to that hunger experiment at Minnesota. And I think with that, I'll finish and say that Dora and I are here, and we'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Do we have some questions? And I could probably bring a mic to you so that everybody could hear. I see a hand.
First, a comment, and then two questions. I regret deeply that the Courier did not acknowledge this story properly when it happened. It was obviously long before my time. I can't pretend to know what went into that decision, but it hurts my heart that that happened. My two questions are this. Can you speculate as to the primary emotional response from the Hutterite colony following this tragedy? Sadness, anger, reverence. My second question is, the change that we saw in World War II compared to World War I, again, this is speculation. How much did this story have to do with that?
I would say that the response of the Hutterian community is they are as gripped by the story as you were here tonight. I've been telling it for many years now. I've told it to Hutterite audiences, to non-Hutterite audiences, and they are all equally moved. I think part of that is because, well, for several reasons. These were family men, and they were young. They were not very well educated at all. They probably had a grade 6 education, and yet they had this courage to insist that we are not taking up arms, and that was all there was to it. And many people have been inspired by it. Over supper, I was telling Duane and some of the museum people about a Jewish mother living near Alcatraz and her son. They are lawyers, and they were gripped by the story. Her name is Susan Cohn, and a few years ago, she actually set out to have a plaque erected. She said, this isn't the Hutterite story, this is a human rights story. But she did not get anywhere in setting up a plaque. And also over the years, as evidence of how the Hutterites see the story, many, many Hutterites from the Dakotas, and especially from Canada, when they've had occasion to travel south, took the opportunity to visit Alcatraz. I think now it's no longer possible to go down into the dungeon because it's not safe, but there have been occasions where guards would secretly give the Hutterites access to it, recognizing that this story is part of their history and that these people were their people. Am I responding to your first question sufficiently? And your second question was, I'm not sure, I think Duane should answer the second one.
Before I answer the second one, the journalist in me needs to say a few words about the Freeman Courier. Different ownership in 1919. I love the Freeman Courier now. It's a wonderful community newspaper. If you don't subscribe and you live in this area, I hope you will subscribe. The journalist in me has suffered mightily over these years, as we have seen, especially the last 20 years, we have seen digital upstarts come in and siphon away advertising dollars and so forth. And anyway, I could go on. You know, I'm a journalism professor at Goshen College, but I will stop. Subscribe to the Freeman Courier. To your second question. The Hofer brothers were Exhibit A for the American Civil Liberties Union as it lobbied the federal government to begin a more humane treatment of conscientious objectors. There was fierce lobbying going on, and as they reached out to the president, sometimes with they had family connections to reach President Wilson, and describe the situation in which people were being strung by their wrists so that their toes barely touched, a form of torture known as high cuffing, and that they were being given bread and water, and that they were being held in darkness. and dungeon-like conditions. And there's a quote from President Wilson saying, "This is barbaric. This is not how we live and treat people in the United States." And it was the Hofer brothers who were Exhibit A, whose stories were being shared both during the war, but then also after the war, in an effort to prod the federal government to do right by its people. And yeah.
Others? Thanks, Jeremy, for the question. Tim?
Could each of you explain the first time or how you came to know this story?
It's a story to which I heard references while I was growing up. I never recall hearing it in such detail. We were able to put these details together. For example, Susan Cohn, the lawyer from California, offered us copies of the court-martial transcript, so that added some details. But I know that in my colony there was one man, the Paulfitter. In a Hutterite colony, when a young person decides to become baptized, they usually go to the minister with that request, and it's always just before Easter on Palm Sunday. And I know that this Paulfitter, Uncle Paul, when running ahead of myself here. So when there's a group of baptismal candidates who want to be baptized, one of the things they are required to do is, for the 6 or 7 weeks before Palm Sunday, every Sunday afternoon they go to the houses of the deacons of the community, and each of these deacons gives them an admonition on an aspect of community life. And this Paulfitter told them this story, among other things, long before I was old enough to be baptized. And I frequently heard references to the Alcatraz brothers, but until I was able to read it for myself, I didn't really know the whole story. But then one year, my sister got married and moved to the Baker Colony, that's by McGregor. At the same time, in that community, she had a sister-in-law who had grown up in Minnesota in Big Stone, Becky, who married her brother Jake. So this was a woman with whom I had contact. And she was able to give us the American version of it with a lot of those details about selling the livestock and all of those things, as well as the fact that their graves are still at Rockport Colony, and that on the grave markers is the word martyr. Well, those details were, to me, incredibly impressive. So it grows over time. And of course, now we have Duane's book with even more details. Does that answer your question? Yes. And and when I was in my early 20s, I was asked by the minister of my colony to help him teach German school. And he said, "I'm older now and I haven't taught the younger children for a long time. You come and do that. You tell them stories and sing with them." And so that was one of the stories I ended up telling them. So I was given a lot of opportunity to be exposed to the story. And then one year after the in-service for German teachers in Hutterite schools began in the mid-70s, we had a university student from the University of Berlin come to Manitoba and visit various colonies to study the Hutterites. And he was here in November, which is when our in-service was, so he spoke to us at James Valley Colony, this assembled group of Hutterite German teachers. And it was the first time in his life that he was exposed to the fact that here in North America we celebrate, in Canada we call it Armistice Day. What do you call it? Veterans Day, right? Yes, we call it Armistice Day. And he never heard about a holiday like that. "So what are you doing as Hutterite German teachers?" he asked. I mean, these guys, this is the day that celebrates war heroes. And then he said to us, "I would take a story like this one about the Alcatraz brothers. This is your children's story. This is the story they should be hearing." So it looks like something or someone has not let that story die.
You referred to them several times as the Alcatraz brothers. That's how you refer to them? Really? Wow.
That's how we know the story. Did you have a question for Duane? Same question. I'm sorry.
So I remember walking across campus at Goshen College one day and just happened to be able to walk beside Joe Springer, who's the curator of the Mennonite Historical Library there. And I was making small talk. I said, Joe, I just finished writing my dissertation. I have free time. What should I research now? And he said, without skipping a beat, what about the Hofer brothers? And with that, I started looking into the story, and I was, I was only able to read a few pages. The historical record was pretty bare. But what I read was incredibly moving. And I thought, wow, this is an amazing story. How, could it be told more fully? And it was, I started doing some research, but still wasn't convinced there was a book. And then John Roth, who was a history professor at Goshen College and also involved with the Mennonite Historical Library, happened to be included in an email from Sarah Kleinsasser at the Miller Colony in Montana, and she was writing to some people at Goshen, just telling them how things were going. It was around Christmas time, a little news update. And John forwarded that email to me and said, oh, by the way, she's the granddaughter of one of the Hofers who died. And now I had contact information for her and a kind of nudge to reach out. And so I did. I called, and they said, sure, you can come out, and we'll be happy to at least meet you and talk with you. And I didn't know if they would share letters, and I was kind of grilled when I was out there. There was a little bit of a kind of interrogation is probably too strong, but just checking of sources before they would be ready to turn over letters. And eventually they did. They provided these letters, and it was the letters that allowed for a kind of personal, powerful voice to come through. And I'm going to share just a couple lines here. So these lines were written as the men were traveling from Alcatraz to Fort Leavenworth. And Joseph wrote, "Let us praise God that the bloodletting has now come to an end, as we had hoped. But now is the time, as our Lord Jesus taught us that such a time would come, which has never been before, as long as the world has stood and will never be again." There's an eloquence there, and also this deep sense of foreboding. And this is right before two of them died. And then Michael likewise signed off on the same day. These are their last words. And he wrote, "If we do not see each other again in this world, then we will see one another in the next world." And indeed, it came to pass.
With that, unless somebody has a burning question, I think we will close. That is touching, to say the least. Thank you. Duane and Dora, what an amazing privilege it is to have you here and to have you sharing your stories, this story. And thanks to all of you who came. I am honored to have you here and appreciate your support, appreciate your donations that you left when you entered. Thank you.